Hi everyone, Pastor Jimmy at Mount Pleasant Baptist Church. Today we're going to continue our study on the characteristics and attributes of God. We'll look at Genesis chapter 18 and see the characteristics and attributes we can learn from God in that chapter. So, go grab your Bible, pause the video, and read Genesis chapter 18. Once you finish reading Genesis chapter 18, we'll come back and start the video, and then we'll begin this study. All right, now that you've had a chance to read Genesis chapter 18, we want to jump right in with everything that happens in this chapter. Here, the first thing we see is the Lord visiting Abraham in person. And I just want you to think about this for a second. Here is Abraham. God has talked to him. God has visited him in visions. We've seen him make covenants with him. But now all of a sudden we see God visiting Abraham in person. This shows us the unique friendship that God had with Abraham and the friendship that He wants to have with all of us. You see, as you read through the chapter, you'll also see a conversation between Abraham and God. And then as you see this conversation, as you read this conversation, you'll begin to see some of the friendship that they had through this conversation as well. So it's obvious that God considered Abraham a friend. And I believe that God considers those who have called upon Jesus Christ for salvation as friends also. And He sees us as friends. But one important thing to remember here also is the way that Abraham still approached God. He still approached God, yes, as a friend, but he approached Him as Lord. He approached Him as greater than he was. Abraham served Him. He rushed around. He personally served God. We see later on in verse 27, we see Abraham say, "Now that I have been so bold as to speak to the Lord, though I am nothing but dust and ashes." You see, Abraham understood his place. Yes, he understood that God was his friend. And yes, he understood that he was a friend of God. But he also still understood God's holiness and God's righteousness. And he understood his place compared to God's place. And we need to consider God a friend. But we also need to be careful not to consider God less than what He really is. We need to take our cue from Abraham and understand that God is still God. He is still holy and He is still righteous. But at the same time, we should take solace and comfort in knowing that God is our friend. The next characteristic we see here is in verse 25. God is called judge of all the earth by Abraham. So God has heard the sin, the cries that are coming up from Sodom and Gomorrah. He has seen all the trouble that is there. And God has decided that He must destroy this place. And so Abraham begins to plead for this place. He's really pleading for this place because his nephew Lot lives there. And so he begins to plead, but he looks at God and he says that, "God, you are judge of all the earth. You're a judge over everything." I think it would do well if all of us would remember this title for God, that He is judge. You see, we as humans over the years have always tried to make ourselves this and give ourselves this title. But in reality, God is the only one that can judge. Why? Because God is the only one that is righteous. God is the only one that can be the true judge. But many times our pride and our arrogance get in the way of this, and we perceive ourselves as the judge. And one of the worst things that we can do a lot of times I see is people perceiving themselves as judge because they are a Christian or because God has maybe placed them in a position of leadership. But even though God has done that, God is not putting us as judge over others. God is the ultimate judge. Let me show you an example of what I mean from the New Testament. There's a story in the New Testament where two of Jesus' closest apostles got, as we like to say, got a little too big for their britches. And they went and they thought they could be a judge over an entire village. Listen to this story from Luke chapter 9. This is Luke chapter 9, verses 51 through 56. It says, "As the time approached for Him, Jesus, to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. He sent messengers on ahead who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for Him. But the people there did not welcome Him because He was heading for Jerusalem. When the disciples James and John saw this, they asked, 'Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them?' But Jesus turned and rebuked them. Then He and the disciples went to another village." Do you see what happened here? James and John, two disciples that were arguing over who was the greatest and who was going to be at the right hand of Jesus. saw what this village did, and they thought they had the power. They thought that it was within their ability to call fire down and judge this city. Notice what Jesus did, though. Jesus rebuked them for trying to judge the city. One, they had no power to call fire down. Only God can do that. Two, they had no power to judge. Only God can judge. Only Jesus Christ could have been the one to have done that. So we see their folly in trying to be a judge. We need to understand that God is the only judge. And then as this conversation continues, we continue seeing Abraham asking God, God, if there's only this many righteous people in Sodom and Gomorrah, will you save it? And this many and this many. And finally they get down to 10. And Abraham doesn't want to push his luck any farther, but he says, God, if there's only 10 righteous people there, will you spare the whole place because of these 10? And God said he would. This shows us God's compassion. We've seen God's compassion many times before throughout the New Testament. But here we're seeing God's compassion not only on those that are righteous, but those that are not righteous. He was willing to save the entire area from all this sin if there was only 10 righteous people, so that those 10 righteous would not fall under the same punishment. Unfortunately, as we'll see as we continue to read, that there weren't even 10 righteous people in this city. But we do see God's compassion that he was willing to save the entire city for the sake of 10 righteous people. So in this chapter of Genesis today, we see God being a friend. As long as we remember our place, we need to consider him as friend. We see God being the judge. We need to understand our place there as well and make sure that we're not the ones that are trying to judge, and we're not the one trying to be the judge, especially trying to be a judge in God's name or in Jesus Christ's name. Remember James and John and the rebuke that they received from Jesus for trying to be the judge. And then finally, remember that we serve a compassionate God, and we need to have that same compassion in our lives that God is willing to have in the lives of others and in our lives for us as well.